start by layering the main color, the soft and stable, in the contrast. Then fuse or spray baste them together. Hold your cutter perpendicular to the cutting mat so that you get a straight edge when cutting. Mark lines using a permanent fine tip marker. First, we'll stitch around the center square. I'll take one stitch while hanging onto the tails and pull my bobbin thread up so I know right where it is and I won't get a tangle underneath. Then I'll just start driving. I'll stitch all the way around the square, pivoting at each corner. When I reach the starting point, I'll just overlap those stitches about 1/2 inch. To stitch the corners of our basket, first I stitch across a scrap that's the same thickness as the piece that we're using. Then I use my walking foot to stitch a scant 1/4 inch along the marked corner lines. I usually move my needle over to get it exactly where I want it. I stop at the corner with the needle down and pivot, and then stitch to the end of the corner. Trim each corner close to your stitching using a scissors. To stitch the corners, I'll fold the corner with the contrast side facing out. I've got the edges even, and I'll put a couple of wonder clips along the edge to hold it in place. And then I'll stitch a 1/4 inch seam along that edge. Notice how I'm stitching right on top of that marked line, and I'll go to the end and backstitch. It opens to make a nice square corner. I stitch again 1/8 inch from the edge, and then I'll use a scissors to just trim one layer off next to that 1/8 inch stitching. That's going to reduce bulk and make it easier to work with. I stitched a binding strip to the corner seam. I'll tuck the end under a 1/4 inch, wrap it around that raw edge, and then stitch it in place. That's going to make a nice finish for those seams. To keep that bottom corner from raveling, I'll trim it at an angle and then dab a little bit of Fray Check on. I've pressed my binding strip in half, and now I'm going to do a quick finish along the edge. I'm pressing that at an angle, and then I'll trim it so that it looks like this, kind of like a teepee. Next, I'll start right at that end, and I'll stitch it to the basket a 1/4 inch from the edge. You can use a 1/4 inch foot or a walking foot and experiment to see what works better for you. Do you like working around the open arm like this? Or if you want, you can turn your basket inside out and work on the flat surface of the machine. At the end, I'll tuck the end in and then stitch all the way across that tucked in end, and then I'm ready to fold it around and finish it. To hold that little tucked end in place, I like to position a little piece of wonder tape. I'll stick it on and then peel the paper off, tuck the end in, and that adhesive will just hold it in place so that it stays really nice. I also like to use the wonder tape adhesive basting tape along the edge to hold it in place while I'm sewing the second half of my binding. All I need to do is peel the paper off and wrap that edge around, and I position it just past the seam so I'm sure that I'll catch it when I'm top stitching. It helps to get the binding ready all the way around before it's time to stitch. Now I'll top stitch along the edge of the binding, and it's much easier because I don't have to wrestle with the binding. It's already being held in place by the wonder tape. When you're stitching along the binding, it's a little bit awkward, and just remember that you only need to worry about the few inches that are in front of your needle. The rest of the basket can get kind of squished out of the way. To make the dividers, you can leave the main color in place, or if you'd like to reduce bulk, just peel that main color off. Line the edges of the divider up with the fabric rectangle. You'll have some fabric extending on each end. Stitch a 1/4 inch seam, and then pull the edges together on the opposite side and clip them together and stitch again. These dividers will then get turned right side out, and when they get turned, that fabric is a little bit larger, and so it has enough room to wrap around the edge and make a nice finish that looks like binding. Then I press to remove any wrinkles, and at the end I fold those ends just a little bit at an angle so that there's room to wrap them around. Tuck the raw end in, wrap it around the edge, and stitch it in place. I've marked a center line on one of my dividers. I'm stacking them with the edges even. I stitched across a scrap again to get started. It helps the walking foot go. Then I'm going to stitch these together along that marked line. Be sure and back stitch at the beginning and the end, and even though this seems really thick, it will stitch easily because that foam compresses right down as your machine drives across it. Now it's time to stitch the divider to the basket. I'm lining up the end of one of the dividers with that marked line on the side of the basket, and to hold it in place, I'll just put a couple of wonder clips along the edge. That's going to hold it right where it belongs, and the edge will be right on top of the line. Then when it's time to sew, I'm going to put the basket behind the presser foot and kind of back that presser foot onto the divider. I'm pulling my threads out so that I'm sure that I have both threads. I know where they are so I don't get tangles underneath. And then I'll position that presser foot right about a ½ inch before the end of the divider. And the first thing I'll do is back stitch all the way to the end of the divider. And then I'll stitch forward and come out to that outer edge. I'm stitching real close to the divider's edge, and I'm just going right along until I get to the end, and I'll back stitch again. I'll repeat that with each end of the divider. You get a little bit less room to work each time, but it is possible to do it. When you get them all finished, it's time to put your pint jars in and get organized.